What's going on, guys? This is Empty Box, and this is the second part of a series of videos I will be doing on the American open wheel Civil War. In this episode, it's the 80s up through about late 1991, somewhere thereabouts, or in other words, the prelude to the war. In the previous episode, I talked about the Indy 500 and the formation of a cart. If you aren't familiar with that, you can find that down in the description, a link to the previous video that I did in this little series. So let us begin. We're going to start with the cars of CART and the 500, as really they were the foundation for the series and frankly what made CART as a series work. Even with the star power, on the CART grid in the Indy 500 during the 80s and the early 90s, they still needed cars to drive. Plus, the driver side of thing is more common knowledge. After all, drivers always get the glory, and nobody needs to cover Manselmania for the 90 billionth time. Although, we could if you want, but yeah. In the late 70s in the USAC series, as well as into the early 80s with the CART series that essentially, for the most part, replaced the USAC series. Again, what I talked about in that previous video, teams building their own cars wasn't entirely uncommon. For the most part, the teams themselves were best suited to build the cars at that point. They knew what a car needed to be competitive at Indy as well as in CART competition from years of experience. Roger Penske had his Penske's, Patrick Racing had the Wildcats, AAWR, and Dan Gurney obviously with the Eagles. Chaparral had a car. There were a couple of old McLarens still kicking around into the early 80s. There was the Longhorn, which was a Williams F1 clone. There was just a bunch of different types of cars on the grid. And, quite frankly, it's something that, if you look back, it's probably closer to what you think of as like Formula One today rather than what it is in IndyCar today. After all, IndyCar today is a spec series, whereas back then, everybody was building their own car. Totally different world. For the most part, though, in these early days, if you weren't building your own chassis yourself in-house, basically, the guys who were winning races were making the chassis that you wanted to buy, obviously. There is a slight problem with this model, though. They were under no obligation to sell them. They often did, but it wasn't really their business. And even when they did, there was no real guarantee that they were giving you a car that was as good as what they were running because, after all, you are the competition. For example, getting your hands on a Penske chassis wasn't exactly the easiest thing in the world. Then in 1981, March arrived. Not the month, but the former Formula One constructor. At this point, selling cars was their business. It was how they were able to sustain their operation. After their ups and downs, their exit from Formula One in the late 70s, they became a constructor of lower Formula cars where they found some success. However, they started to lose ground to the competition there, and then they realized that, hey, you know what? There's a giant untapped market here in CART in the United States, and we can probably build a really good car and sell a lot of cars and make a lot of money, putting the company back in the right track and right direction, and we can get back into Formula One? Yes! And that's what they did. It quickly became the chassis to have, and most importantly, it was made by guys who wanted to sell their cars, as that was the whole business. They weren't fielding a team, so they really didn't have any particular interest in which March won, just that a March won. They had achieved something quite important to the future of CART. It was a good chassis that would be race winning and very capable throughout the years and its various yearly upgrades, as well as it was attainable because they wanted to sell the cars. Then Lola jumped into the pool, becoming a very competitive package from 1983 onward. For the most part, the next 5 years would be defined by Lola and March trading blows with one another as yearly improvements were made. This was quite transformational for American open wheel racing. A competitive car was now as easy to attain as ever, which improved the competition. You simply pay for a car, you get a car, you go get the de facto for the time Cosworth engine, and presto, you have a package capable of making the Indy 500 field and competing in CART. No more reliance upon knowing a guy who knows a guy who is friendly with a guy who can get you one of the good chassis that you actually want type of stuff. From this point on, the team-built cars mentioned earlier were basically 100% on their way out. It was pretty much only Roger Penske who bothered with building his own cars off and on from there on. And even then, Penske preferring to build his cars to get as big of an advantage as possible because Roger Penske gonna Roger Penske, and I think we all know that even still today. He still joined the horde of the March and Lola because they were just that good. And then came the manufacturers. Sort of, but not really, but really, they came. First of all, Lotus was sniffing a potential re-entry to CART and the 500, in 1984 with their unraced 96T, which according to most accounts was basically their 95T Formula 1 car beefed up to crash at 200 plus miles an hour as necessitated by the needs of the speedway. Nothing ever came of it. However, it is often stated that the kart team owners who held the political power within the series, obviously, didn't really want a factory-backed effort in the series, so they just didn't really cooperate all that much. They kind of made it difficult for Lotus to enter, apparently. Couldn't really find too terribly much information on what exactly this all entailed, but obviously the team owners would like to maintain their hegemony over the series because that's the whole point of kart after all. So yeah, it's understandable that that would be the case. The more interesting of the unraced Indy cars from big name manufacturers, though, would of course be the Ferrari. And I'm sure some of you guys out there right now are like, wait, Ferrari made a champ car? What? That's a thing? Yes, that was a thing. That's totally awesome. Unhappy with a rule stipulation in Formula 1 at the time mandating a V8 engine a few years down the line, Ferrari being Ferrari decided to blackmail Formula 1 via kart. Or at the very least, that is my and many other skeptical people's point of view on this ordeal. The less skeptical point of view is that Ferrari had won literally everything except for the Indy 500, and therefore Ferrari wanted to do that because why wouldn't they? That's the one thing they haven't won. What is known about this car, though, is it was a pretty serious effort. It was not something that was just sort of slapped together, and Ferrari was never intending to actually enter the Indy 500 as well as kart. So who knows? Apparently, Ferrari tore down one of the March customer chassis that was supplied by the True Sports team with their driver Bobby Rahal, who would end up winning the 1986 Indy 500 as well as the Kart Series Championship. And it was expected that if the Ferrari effort were to come true, it would be for the 1987 series, likely fielding the True Sports team, likely with Bobby Rahal as the driver, in which case just go ahead and play that one through your mind and how crazy and insane that would be. But long story made short, either it is the most impressive bargaining chip ever built, or Ferrari decided to drop the kart entry, instead refocus on Formula 1, with their goal being complete, and the Formula 1 V12 continuing on. So I think we all ended up winning in the end. Kart's issues were not related because there was no Ferrari, and obviously who doesn't love the screaming Formula 1 3.5 liter V12s that we had in the early 90s? Yes, so everybody's a winner. Interestingly though, I couldn't find anything about the team owners not wanting Ferrari to be blocked like the Lotus had been. I'm just going to go ahead and write that off as Ferrari privilege. But no, really, the manufacturers did indeed actually show up. Up to 1987, the Cosworth DFX, essentially a 2.65 liter turbocharged version of the Cosworth DFV, was the de facto engine to have. As with the Formula 1 through the 70s, the Cosworth option was a solid engine that got the job done a majority of the time. It was good power, good reliability, it was attainable, perhaps not exceptional, but it did the job. They really had a monopoly on the series in terms of engine supply. So of course Roger Penske, being Roger Penske, does what Roger Penske does. He decides that he wants an engine that's going to stomp out the competition. Working with AOWR and funding the development of it, the new AOWR 265A, as it was known then at the time, was unveiled for the 1986 Indy 500 and one of the Penske cars. It would make its full season debut for 1987 with the Penske Patrick Racing as well as Newman Haas teams, or in other words, basically the top teams available. After some issues were fixed, especially from 1988 going forward, it would be the dominant engine to have in the series. It was superior to the Cosworth option and by a pretty sizable advantage. Worth noting, in 1988, it was actually rebadged, same engine, as the Chevrolet Indy V8. There was a minor issue, though, and that was the availability. In these times, AOWR was a relatively small operation, which didn't have enough engines to go around, as well as, well, they didn't have enough manpower to build more and support more. And then you add in the fact that Chevy as a manufacturer, even if it was just badges, as Chevy is prone to do, they didn't really want to be associated with the guys at the back of the pack either, in all likelihood. So obviously this would go on to cause some friction between those who had the Chevy engines, which were dominant, and those who wish they had them, but sadly couldn't get them. And of course, we must mention Porsche. After being pushed primarily by Al Holbert, who had been a former Porsche driver who achieved a lot of success, as well as became the North America Motorsports Division leader, basically. I can't remember what his specific title was, whatever. But Porsche would return in late 1987 to kart, even though they had severely banged their heads with USAC over their Indianapolis 500 entry in 1980. We'll talk about that a little bit later. Their Porsche 2708 chassis, though, it proved exceptionally poor. It seems Porsche and open-wheelers just don't mix. They should really stick to sports cars, apparently. So for 1988, they decided that they would run a March, but with the Porsche engine in the back, after some modifications. And then going forward in 1989, Porsche would basically contract the chassis to March. It'd be a specific Porsche-specific chassis with their engine in it, more or less a outsourced factory effort, if you will. While they weren't the worst by any means, they were very firmly mid-pack, and they did achieve one win with Teo Fabi. It certainly wasn't what you would expect from Porsche. Again, maybe they should just stick to sports cars. And most exciting of all, Alfa Romeo showed up. Hold on to your butts, because this one is the goofy one. Intending to originally show up for the 1989 Indianapolis 500, Alfa Romeo was going to build an engine, and it was going to be fielded by Caples Racing in the back of a updated Alfa-specific March. That March would be the 89 CE, as opposed to the Porsche March 89P, which was a different car. So yes, March was running two essentially factory-backed programs from their operation for the IndyCar side of things at the same time, and they were different from one another, and they were getting into Formula One again. However, the 89 CE was largely just a minor evolution on the previous year's March 88C customer chassis. This would be a mess. As for the engines, well, they showed up late. They missed the Indianapolis 500, which kind of a big deal. According to Alfa, labor strikes in Italy held the development of the engine back. According to the team who would be fielding the engines, they heard nothing about a labor strike until it was just an excuse at that point. Well, or at least that's what it seemed. Who knows? Were there any labor strikes in Italy in 1989? I don't know. Regardless, only two March 88Cs, driven by any other team with any other engines, actually made the field for the 1989 Indianapolis 500. So you have to figure, given that the 89 CE was largely just a pretty minor improvement over the 88C, you have to figure even if the engines were available for the 1989 Indy 500, they may not have even made the show, which obviously would be quite embarrassing. Once the engines did arrive at Detroit, well, they weren't spectacular by any means. The Alfa Romeo entry was mid-pack at best. And this is where it goes even more sideways and becomes part of the lore. In 1989, Pat Patrick, longtime team owner and successful team owner of Patrick Racing, decided he wanted to retire. So he made an agreement. After the 1989 season, Patrick Racing and the dominant Chevy engines that they had would be taken over by one of their former drivers, Chip Ganassi. Sponsor Marlboro and driver Emerson Fittipaldi in a package deal would go to Penske in 1990 in return for Patrick Racing receiving the Penske chassis in 1989. Basically, everyone was a winner in this agreement. Then Patrick Racing just kept winning. Driving for Patrick Racing, Emerson Fittipaldi won the 1989 Indy 500 and kart championships. Suddenly, Pat didn't want to leave, but by then it was already too late. The wheels were in motion. So naturally, he formed another Patrick Racing for 1990, not the old Patrick Racing, which had gone to Chip Ganassi, and they partnered with Alfa Romeo. They would be the Alfa Romeo-backed team from now. In late 1989, one of those Ilmore Chevrolet V8s ended up in Italy. Uh-oh, SpaghettiOs. Alfa had just been given the dominant engine to tear down and inspect by Patrick. This much is known. What is not so much known, well, at least as far as I can tell, is who actually owned that engine. There's actually a lot of debate of whose engine that technically was. Some say it was actually AOWR's engine at that point by the time it had been shipped to Italy because of the engine lease agreement with AOWR. Some say it was Patrick Racing's engine, so technically he could still do this because he sent it out before it was no longer his. And some people say that it's actually technically Chip's engine because it was his engine after, well, Patrick Racing became his. Who knows? Alfa chose not to copy the AOWR Chevrolet engine, either because they didn't deem it necessary, they didn't have the capability to do so, they had too much pride and believed they could do better, or they just believed it was maybe morally wrong. I really don't know, but they decided not to copy the engine, and they were quite unsuccessful from there on. Not that they were ever very successful in the first place. However, they had made their contribution, and it was a pretty substantial one. Thanks to the calamity unleashed through that whole mess of just giving an engine to your enemy, basically, engine leases became even more restrictive as no one wanted to have their engine given away to the competition. This really made it a bit more difficult for teams to acquire the higher caliber engines. It's also worth noting that years on down the line, the AOWR Chevrolet engines would become available to any customers, not just the chosen few. There was one exception though. The new iteration of Patrick Racing would not be allowed to purchase a Chevrolet AOWR engine. Justice hath been served. And then we come to the 1980 Porsche, which we briefly mentioned earlier, Buicks, and push rods. Under USAC rule, which was applicable only to the Indy 500 at the time, so-called stock block engines had been eligible for higher turbo boost. This was a rule designed to encourage more simple, cheaper, easier to build and maintain engines to help control costs. Heck, even using this rule, a school bus engine qualified for the friggin' Indy 500, because you know what? America, fuck yeah! These engines would technically still be allowed in kart. However, they did not receive a boost advantage at all, which meant that they were entirely uncompetitive and therefore basically useless outside of the Indianapolis 500. As for that 1980 Porsche Indy 500 engine, it was a 935 derived 2.65 liter air-water cooled hybrid flat 6 turbo capable of about 800 horses reportedly. Some of you guys may recognize, yes, this is basically the engine that would end up in the Porsche 956 a couple of years later. Porsche claimed that this engine was a stock block production-based engine and expected to run at the higher boost pressure. During its one test at Ontario Motor Speedway in California, a track which was very much a clone of Indianapolis Motor Speedway, the car had been very, very successful. It was supposed to be a secret test, however, apparently some spies had infiltrated this test and had caught wind of just how good this engine was going to be. AJ Foyt caught wind of this test and knew he wouldn't be competitive with the Porsche. Being the biggest name to remain in the USAC camp by far during the original split which created kart, he had a lot of pull within USAC. Spearheaded by his lobbying, the Porsche was reclassified as a race-based engine, which, let's be honest, it really was, and therefore it lost the boost advantage that it was expected to have. And obviously Porsche does one thing, they go in to dominate each and every time. So with that, they ended up withdrawing after a whole lot of frustration and back and forth between Porsche and USAC, and that was that. It never happened. As for Buick, they had the leading stock block motor in their V6 during the 80s and the 90s. These engines were very, very powerful in qualifying thanks to the higher boost pressure available, but they had a fatal flaw. The only thing more predictable than Buick V6s going stupid fast in qualifying was Buick V6s blowing up in the race. The Buick V6's reliability was even worse than today's McLaren Hondas in Formula 1. Only twice did these engines or their descendants actually finish the full 500-mile race distance. Kind of a big deal for a 500-mile race. Let's be real. The high boost was simply uncontrollable in the race. At the high boost, the engine just would not last the full 500 miles, and then at the lower boost, the engine lost its one advantage, leaving it uncompetitive in race situations. However, they were available and always fast in qualifying for the 500, which is why a lot of the Indy-only teams ran them. While they stood little chance of actually propelling a team to victory given the reliability issues, it was a very good way to get a small team into the field. And from there, well, maybe this would be the one time the Buick would keep its guts inside the engine block. Just this one time. But it basically never happened. So then USAC changed the rules. Realizing how uncompetitive the Buick V6 and other stock block programs had been in race trim and how unreliable they were, they opened up the rule book in 1991, if I'm not mistaken. No longer was a stock production block required for the engine, but rather just 2 valves per cylinder pushrod operated engines would qualify for the extra boost and displacement advantage. They figured this would allow for a truly competitive, low-cost, reliable, low-tech engine, which was the goal of these rules at Indianapolis. In their eyes, it allowed for the Buick engine to basically be strengthened and overhauled to hopefully last the full 500-mile distance. In reality, these rules created a beast unlike any other. Hope you guys enjoyed. Bye.